Hello, welcome to part two. All right. Self-regulation, the ability to calm yourself back down, the ability to not just calm yourself down, but to regulate yourself, to control yourself. And sometimes the way that we control ourselves is by recognizing when we're upset and being able to calm ourselves down. Self-regulation also relates to other things too, like being able to stay focused on something, right? Like for you to not break your attention and look at your phone while you're watching this presentation or whatever requires you to have the ability to self-regulate yourself and control your thoughts and your behaviors and your emotions. And so these kind of all go together, your behaviors, your emotions, your thoughts. And as people get better at regulating that, they get better at navigating their social world, or I say they're like increased social competence. Sorry, I'm gonna have to have the odd coffee sip on camera now since it's a continuous feed. This increased ability to self-regulate is heavily linked with the changes in the prefrontal cortex, right? So as the prefrontal cortex area of the brain is getting stronger, the ability for the child to self-regulate is also improving. I want to show you something cool. So I can do a little bit more since I'm in Zoom in a different way too. So I have on the screen on the last slide there, you'll see that there is a link to this, and I'll show you again in a sec. But this is really cool. This is like a 3D brain, and you can look at parts like the medulla oblongata, which is like related to, say, breathing. But you could also like look up, like say for example, today we're talking about here the prefrontal cortex, right? That like, and it's kind of cool because you can like rotate it, see all the different parts, and see like, well, what's the premotor cortex look like, and what does the optofrontal optiofrontal cortex, that's a tough one, right? So this helps us understand the consequences of complex behaviors and adjust those behaviors to reach a specific desired outcome. Problems in this area can be linked to depression. Interesting, eh? Okay. So you'll see here, like where I say 3D brain link in the PowerPoint you have will take you to that website. It's pretty cool. So as children are getting older, sorry, I just finished ahead of them. It's like 10:40 here in the morning on Wednesday. I just finished my morning class. Um, okay, so see, like if I was doing this in PowerPoint, I would have cut that because that was just like 20 seconds of dead time. Sorry about that. Um, so by the time a child's 4 or 5, they're starting where it says there at first that they're starting to determine or describe themselves more in psychological terms, like that they're kind or that they're a good friend. And you're starting to notice less description of self tied to physical characteristics like hair color, eye color, height, stuff that like younger kids would do. And some of this is because they're starting to be able to realize that they're their own unique person that's different than others. And they're starting to realize that other people take in things and think about things differently. They're starting to be able to take people's perspectives. Right. And it's like, okay, well, what would it mean for you to try to take my perspective, right? Like, what's it like being the teacher that never meets the students and lives in a different city, but is trying to like have some kind of like relationship or teaching relationship with them? It's like if you were to and if you were to do that, right? If you were to try to think of what it was like to be me, and you don't have to picture yourself as like a bald 40-year-old, you can just be like, what would it be like to be the one teaching? And you're actually picturing it. It's like, well, what are you actually doing? You're actually doing a pretty complicated kind of daydream perspective taking exercise. You're trying to think of what my experience would be like. Because our experiences aren't identical. Because you have your own experience that I must have my own experience. And this, you also know that if we're playing a game together and I leave and it's annoying to you, then if you leave, it would probably be annoying to me. And the reason I said that is because the word on the screen, joint commitment, caught my eye. And what the joint commitment means is that example. So say my daughter, no one's here, but like say my daughter and her cousin Susie were over there playing. And I said, Evie, come here for a second. And I was like, I need to tell you something. And I started telling her some story and it's taken a really long time. And she's like, Daddy, I need to get back to Susie. Like part of her brain is still joint committed to the activity she was doing with Susie because she knows that Susie's still playing that game. She's committed to that mental bubble almost. It's actually a pretty deep concept, this idea of joint commitment. Another thing starts to realize happen. A kid starts to learn that they can lie, that they can say things that aren't true. I didn't just have a cookie. So can I have a cookie? It's like, wow, they have cookie crumbs on their face. It's like, and smarter kids start to tend to lie earlier. And if we were a live class, I would push this question to you. It's like, as soon as you learn how to lie, what else do you learn? As soon as you learn how to lie, what else do you learn? Well, the other thing you learn is that everyone else might be lying too. Learn you can lie. You simultaneously learn that you can be lied to. And that's why I'm referring to this as like sort of the birth of skepticism. It's not a surprise that people start challenging like earmuffs if your kids are around. But it's why kids at this age will start to challenge things like Santa and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and religion sometimes, right? So it's like just basically anything that you were told to believe it just to believe it. Like just believe it because that's what it is. And you realize, well, wait a second, I could tell you that something's the way it is and be lying. Are you lying? If I can think something and tell you I think the total opposite, then that also sort of shatters my trust in the veracity or like the not veracity, the of your words. Verily, 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 verily means truthfully, but I was trying to think of veril. I don't think that's the right word, but anyways. So yeah, associated with frontal cortex development. So the other part of this is that like what was actually happening is the brain's getting stronger. The brain's allowing you to do a function, do a thing that you weren't able to do before. Now you're getting better at, and remember we're talking about kids, so picture like a 6 or 7 year old. Now the kid's getting better at very specific type of imaginative cognition. The imaginative cognition associated with assuming or not even assuming, because it's not like you're becoming a different person, but what you're trying to do is make a mental picture movie about what it's like to be someone else. And that's actually a pretty advanced cognitive act. Two main ways that we see this a kind of jump in ability to take perspective. So I have written down here, perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that perspective taking improves during childhood, given its reliance on executive function, which means that one of the reasons perspective taking gets better is because the overall processing of your brain gets stronger. Your executive functioning gets stronger. and you get more control over your mind. And one of the things that more control of your mind sounds like a weird thing to say, but like we can talk about it more directly by using these terms cognitive inhibition and cognitive flexibility. Cognitive inhibition means if you actually tried to do that. So when I said, like, imagine if you tried to picture what it was like to be the teacher in the scenario, what you had to actually do is almost like pause your own perspective and allow yourself the cognitive flexibility and just the space to have this like elaborated daydream about what it would be like to be Mike. What it would be like to be Mike. Everyone wants to be like Mike. Everyone wants to be like Mike. Used to be a commercial. Obviously, they're talking about Michael Jordan, not me. Again, I'd probably cut that part out if I was doing this in PowerPoint. Yeah, you're seeing me a little bit more raw, a little bit more real, I guess. To engage in perspective taking, a child needs to exhibit both cognitive inhibition and cognitive flexibility. They need to be able to both be flexible enough to do that, and they have to be able to pause their distraction. They have to be able to control their own thoughts enough to consider someone else's perspective, to make room to consider someone else's perspective. And that's sort of the idea, is like, it's why sometimes paying attention in class is hard. It's like, it's not just paying attention. It's also resisting the urge to pay attention to something different. I tell my students this all the time. You never stop paying attention. Wait, and then I wait till they look at me and I say, well, then try to make it a joke. And I'm like, now you might stop paying attention to me, but you never stop paying attention. It's like your attention just shifted from whatever I said to out the window, to on your phone, to your friend, to back to me, back to your friend, back to me, back to your phone, back to outside, to me, to outside. It's like you're shifting what your cognitive system's aiming at. You're focusing on different things, which is a better way to say it. But when you're awake, you're paying attention to something. So to engage in something like perspective taking actually requires both the ability to think that creatively or flexibly and the ability to control your mind enough to allow yourself to do that and not be immediately interrupted by other distractive thoughts. Okay, so gender, let's do some of the basic terms first. Gender, the characteristics, behavioral, and maybe I'll just say characteristics that are associated. So like characteristics, think of that as meaning like if there's a character in a show, there's certain things that character does that define that character, that are their characteristics. And so characteristics means like, well, you know what the word means. I don't know why I'm breaking it down. Gender refers to the characteristics of people as either male or female. Gender identity, this sense of being male or female. Most children will acquire it by the time they're 3. I understand that there's things like intersex and that this is a complicated topic, but in general, most kids by the time they're 2 or 3, it's one of the first things they can say. Like my daughter right now is 2, and she could easily tell you what gender her cousins are. It's like one of the first categories kids can, as soon as kids can talk, they can tell you that, which means they could probably tell you it earlier if they could do it in a nonverbal way. Excuse me. During the preschool years, most children will increasingly act in ways that match the culture's gender roles, right? So it's like, and we can argue, and in your other classes, I'm sure you do have conversations about like gender roles and problems with them or whatever, but from a psychology perspective, we're sort of not making that point. It's like you could say that there's lots of problems with gender roles and how we depict men and women in movies or whatever, right? I don't mean or whatever, but I mean, you could make those kind of points. But my point here is that regardless of all of that, we model behavior to kids. And one of the ways we model behavior to kids is around gender. So from a psychology perspective, this whole conversation of gender roles, and even you can hear it even in the language, gender roles, is under this bigger bracket of like role modeling or behavior or observational learning, or like whatever you want to call it, like social learning. This is a nurture side of gender, right? Despite the obvious hormonal and anatomical aspects of the difference. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of different ways of talking about sort of the nurture side of gender. And the first one I'm going to talk about is, you'll notice if you have the old slide, I used to have a psychoanalytic component in here, and it's just really difficult because if people don't have a real grasp on classical Greek mythology, Freud's ideas around the Oedipus and the Electra complex are very difficult to understand if you don't deeply understand those stories. Because Freud was saying, okay, there's this complex thing that happens. Hey, haven't you all heard this story? Remember how in this story, this main character did this? That's actually a kind of good example of what I'm trying to say. And he was writing to an audience that would have all, the classics were just studied more 100 years ago. It's just as simple as that. People knew who Homer was and had read the Iliad and the Odyssey and were familiar with the Greek heroes. And it's like our dismissal of the classics in modern times is shameful in a lot of ways. But anyways, it's to our own detriment. So anyway, so I'm not as focused on psychoanalytic. I'm thinking of doing a whole presentation on that and adding it to the course somehow. Because it's a hard thing to just touch on. I really need to tell the stories of Oedipus and Electra to make it make sense. And do it properly, not in 2 sentences. So for here, I'm going to talk about 2 main things: social role theory and social cognitive theory, or ways of looking. So social role theory kind of is exactly kind of what the picture implies, that it's like ever since you're little, you're just seeing people. Role theory is sort of taking this idea that we like see people almost like actors, and that you act out what you see. And so little girls act out what they see older girls doing, and little boys act out what they see older boys doing, and we copy more of the people that look closest to us. And that all this is like basically straight out of Bandura's ideas of social observational learning, but that this also applies to gender, that we see people act in certain ways and we notice, and then it shapes how we act. And I'm using we here as meaning like as kids. So that's kind of like this idea, right? And then again, I made this point already, right? That like some of you might be like, well, it's not fair that men are depicted like this and women like this. And I would say, okay, you might have a point. I'm not going to say you have a point because I don't know what specifically that point is. But even if you have a really strong point, what I'm saying is, regardless of how it is, the children are watching and the children are copying. They're copying what they see. They're copying what they see other people who they categorize themselves as similar to behaving and existing. And it's almost like you're copying that role to small extents. It's not like we don't talk about this. Like we talk about the importance of role modeling constantly, right? And having strong role models in people's lives, right? And one of the roles is around gender, that there's a certain aspect of gender that's learned. Again, be wary of anyone that tells you that anything ever is only nature or nurture. This is obviously a nurture side of the argument. We could talk about the differences in shoulder structure and hip structure, and the differences in hormones, the role of testosterone. We could talk about XY chromosomes. There's biophysical, chemical, anatomical, and hormonal differences between male and females. And that's sort of the nature side. And then there's how our culture makes sense of male and female, or male and female. Again, I understand this is a complicated conversation these days, and I'm not a world expert on talking about this in a new style, but like we copy what we see. We mimic behavior. Humans are behavior mimickers, and that can be both good and bad. Now, social cognitive theory goes one more step and says, okay, well, sure, like, sure, you see what, say, I like see what my brother's doing, I see how my dad acts, I see how my other cousins act, and that somehow like influences me. Again, this is obviously like, maybe not obviously, but this is mainly happening under the surface. That it's not like my daughter wakes up in the morning and says to herself, I'm going to go watch what my Aunt Wendy acts like at this family event today so that I can learn what a girl is. It's like, it's not anywhere near that explicit. Or explicit, it's not the word I meant. It's not that manifest. It's not that noticeable. I guess explicit is the right word. It's more implicit. It's more latent. It's more under the water. It's part of the iceberg that's under the water. And so social cognitive theory kind of goes even deeper and says, well, it's actually both, because there's this part under the water that's like what you've sort of absorbed from your culture about how you're supposed to be. But then at the same time, maybe your dad gets mad at you if you play with a certain toy and rewards if you play in with a different toy. So there is like this Skinner operant conditioning, reward punishment aspect of it too. So I say here, child's gender development occurs through observation and imitation of what other people say or do. I should have put probably say or do there because it's not just based on language, obviously. And then also there's this rewarded or punished aspect for what the people in that person's culture consider to be gender appropriate or not. That's an area where cultural differences is going to play a big role, right? So you could absolutely say that cultures are different in what they reward and punish as gender appropriate behavior. Again, I know I'm in a little bit of a landmine field talking about this topic, but I think you're all smart enough to see that I'm trying to do this delicately, and I'm trying to like make this point that like with anything in psychology, it's nature and nurture. It's this complicated interaction between biological organism and culture. So again, this is like when I present these slides in person, sometimes I can read people's face a bit more, right? And it's like, well, I say like mothers are social in most cultures, mothers do most of the socializing towards their daughters and tend to socialize their daughters to be more obedient and responsible than their sons. And people will be like, that sometimes that sentence like rubs people the wrong way. But when they think about it, they're like, it's kind of true. Like, actually, my parents were like a bit more strict with me than my brother. And what you actually find is that that's actually pretty consistent, and that doesn't seem to be heavily influenced by culture, meaning that it seems to be something that you find in a lot of places, this increased restriction on the daughter's autonomy. Like, why does my brother get to go out all night and I have to be home at 10? And this is where I want to make the point that like in a class like this, I'm not saying like girls should be in bed at earlier. I'm not trying to make any kind of like opinion based point. What I'm trying to say is in developmental psychology, we're observational psychologists to a certain extent, which means we look at what we see in the world. We look at 100,000 families and we see, do those parents treat their boys and girls differently? And if the answer is yes, we say that the answer is yes, even if it's uncomfortable. Because I would rather have you not like what I say to you than to have you think that I'm lying to your face. It's like developmental psychology is interested in what observable human behavior. And then evolutionary psychology is sort of trying to explain that. And then you maybe have social psychology, which is maybe trying to critique it or whatever. But again, social psychology gets a lot of hype. social psychology is in a lot of ways sort of the weakest of the psychologies, I would say. Especially if you compare it to like evolutionary psych or clinical psych or biopsych. It's at least the weakest experimentally. Um, but in some ways it's very interesting, right? It's just tough. That's tough. I'll just be honest with you. That's the tough thing about being a teacher in 2023. It's like I used to joke with students like, will there ever come a time where at the beginning of the course I give you a list of 100 topics and you each circle the 20 I'm allowed to talk about, and everyone would laugh, and it's like, I don't know, that joke gets less and less funny. Um, and I think it's important. I think it's important that you're being taught by people that are willing to speak, because I think that's like, if you wanted to just pay a robot to read the textbook to you, technology exists that can do that. It's like one of the things I'm trying to do with teaching this course is try to contextualize and try to link things together and try to help make things a little bit more understandable. Like, it's like, I understand though, once I start being like, moms are like this, dads are like this, girls are like this, boys are like this, that everybody's hair goes up and everybody gets upset, and it's understandable. But at the same time, it's like we need to be reasonable, and we need to be scientists about this. If we're saying we're scientists, if we're just social theorists, it's like depends on how you're actually trying to approach your life. Yeah. Fathers tend to, again, engage, and this is, I find this point annoying, but it's no less true, tend to, because I only have daughters, right, to say like they tend to spend more attention to their sons. It's like, is that necessarily true? And it's true when you look at observational data. If you were actually going to stand in 1,000 different families and observe how much time each parent's spending with each kid, you'd see that dads tend to spend more time with the sons, especially around things like discipline and activities, tend to really push more skill development and academic development stuff. Um, More likely to push boys in areas related to things like competition and conflict. And I can't even think that's true in my upbringing. Like, my dad pushed me super hard in sports, especially hockey. And like, I don't think he pushed my sister at all at sports, really. So again, that's completely anecdotal, right? Which anecdotal just means like, that's not like some research study. That's just like me telling a story. But it's an anecdote. It's like one story to make a point. But like, when you look at thousands of families, like in developmental psychology, we're looking at norms and means, and which means we're looking at like what we see when we observe huge amounts of people. We see that fathers tend to socialize more around things like rough and tumble play, and less directly with nurturing the children. Now again, it's like, I think some of that is changing a bit, but not as much as people think. And it's not as culturally specific as people think either. This isn't a North America thing. Again, this is like, I had to talked about a similar topic with my Kitchener students the other day, and not the other day, but this is actually a few weeks ago. This brought up a kind of heated conversation, not between me and the students, but just, and not even between students at each other, but just in general. Like, people just had different opinions on this. Like, that there's greater pressure for boys to conform to traditional male roles than for girls to. That like a group of, remember, we're talking about kids here, right? We're not talking about your college class. We're talking about like, if my daughter went to school today, and again, I know how this a tricky topic. But if my daughter went to school today in clothes more associated with what a boy would wear, the idea would be that she'd probably get less pushback than the opposite. Again, I'd be interested to know if you agree with that, right? And again, I'm not asking if you think that's right or wrong. I'm saying that it's an insight into the social pressure people experience. And that the differences between male and female, that's the other thing, is like there's definitely differences between males and females, but there's also incredible overlap. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about are averages, like the average male or the average boy and the average girl, with the understanding that there's a lot of boys that aren't the average boy and a lot of girls that aren't the average girl. And so all of these are, yeah, considerable gender overlap exists. And these differences might be due primarily to biological factors, sociological factors, or both, right? So why are some, and again, it's just this nature nurture. Why aren't all boys the same and why aren't all girls the same? Well, it's like, could you ask a tougher question that sounds simple? It's like the real reason they're different is because of biology, sociology, sociological factors, or like basically the world that they're growing up in, basically nurture, nature nurture. Yeah, and I even put in brackets, I should just read the classic nature nurture interaction again. And it's why I started the course saying, like, sometimes when we get into difficult topics, a good fallback is this nature nurture because it forces us to look at the interaction between biological systems in the world that those biological systems are in, the culture, the environment, the social world, whatever word you want to use for nurture. And then there is like this concept of androgyny, or of individuals having the presence of both characteristics. Yeah, one of the big things that is difficult for parents is how to handle negative emotionality, especially like tantrums or outbursts or anything like that. And the way the literature talks about this is this idea of emotional coaching. So it's like it's more focused on negative emotion. It's a little bit less directly focused on things like positive emotion, but it's kind of saying this idea of how do you deal with the child that's upset. So let's just assume for a second that this picture that we're looking at is like, let's say it's like a dad and his son, and maybe the son just like made a mistake that lost his team the game, and the son's really upset, and maybe the son's even crying, right? What's the dad saying? Is the dad saying like, suck it up, come on, man, stop crying, it's like you're embarrassing us, like you're embarrassing yourself in front of your team? Is he trying to dismiss that emotion, deny, ignore, change the emotion by just basically trying to suppress or repress it? Or what you can probably guess I'm going to say, the more positive growth promoting approach, does the coach take more of a, or does the parent take more of like an emotional coaching perspective, right? Like viewing like, okay, saying something like it's really tough sometimes when we lose, but one of the important things about sports is that you get an opportunity to develop sportsmanship, and you're not going to ever develop sportsmanship if you just win all the time. And the only way you're going to win all the time is if you never play anybody that's any good. And it's like actually one of the biggest things about sports is learning how to lose well, right? Not necessarily like that you're ever trying to lose, but recognizing that, you know, if you shot 49%, okay, so let's just say for basketball, if every time you took a 3-pointer, let's say if you hit 49 out of every 100 3-pointers you took, that would mean you missed more than you took, right? That would mean you missed 51 out of every 100. So if you could continually hit 49 out of 100 3-pointers, not free throws, 3-pointers, you would miss more than you shot. And you would also be the best shooter in the NBA. Even good players miss all the time, right? Like I remember when John Olerud on the Blue Jays once hit for 400 for the year, which means it's a slightly different statistic. It's instead of out of 100, it's out of 1,000. So that means that if he was theoretically going to go up and bat 1,000 times, he would get a hit 400 times, which also meant he would get out 600 times, 200 times more than the other. So he would actually get out more than he would have a successful at bat. And he was like the best hitter in the league that year. So my point is that one of the things you learn in sports is that there's a lot of good players. And sometimes even a player that's not as good as you can beat you if you're not on your best day. And that it can actually be a teaching ground for dealing with complicated emotions. And what you find is that, like, if you can use those situations as an opportunity to help the child understand the emotion and also process the emotion, it can be like almost a coaching experience. Parents can play a key role in helping young children regulate their emotion. Depending on how they talk with their children about emotions, parents can be described as taking an emotion coaching or an emotion dismissing approach. Gottman, make sure this is recording. It's pretty deep into this to make sure this is recording, but okay. Gottman's just, I don't know, I said that like 5 times. That's just the last name of the guy. This is from 2016. He distinguished between these approaches, and then that this distinction is most evident in the way that parents deal with a child's negative emotion. Emotion coaching parents monitor their children's emotions, view their children's negative emotions as opportunities for teaching, assist them in labeling emotions, and coach them in how to deal effectively with those emotions. In contrast, emotion dismissing parents will view their role as to deny, ignore, or change negative emotions. Now, they might not think that, right? It's not like a parent that does that is like, oh, my job is to deny all the kids' emotions. It's that in the pressure, they want the kid's negative thing to stop, and they do it by trying to squash it rather than work through it. Whereas an emotion coaching parent will interact with their children in a less rejecting manner, will tend to use more scaffolding and praise, and be more nurturant than an emotional dismissing parent. Moreover, children of emotion coaching parents are better at soothing themselves when they get upset, are more effective at regulating negative affect or emotion, are better at focusing their attention, have fewer behavioral issues than other children or than children do of emotional dismissing parents. Studies have found that when a father does a lot of emotional coaching with their children, it improves the children's overall social competence. When a mother does a lot of emotional coaching with a child, it reduces oppositional behavior, which means it makes them better at dealing with authority figures in general. So it's kind of an interesting point that there seems to be a parental difference in how that approach affects the child. It's like the mom's doing it helps the kid in one way, the dad doing it helps the kid in a different way. Both things make the kid better able to deal with a complicated and often challenging social world. By the time a kid gets to 10, they tend to start using cognitive strategies to deal with stress. So you can think of that as meaning like, what's a cognitive strategy? Okay, I'm really upset about this thing that just happened, but I'm able to think like, okay, but in the bigger scheme of things, I'm upset that I did bad on one quiz, but that one quiz is one of like 6 things in a class. And that class actually is one of like 6 classes this term. And I'm actually taking 4 terms. So I'm taking 2 terms this year. So 12 classes, and I'm taking 4 years. So I have 48 classes, and each of those classes has 6 things. So this one quiz is really going to have a super small effect on my overall GPA. And so see how in this scenario, I'm trying to use like a long-term perspective to reduce my negative stress about a small thing. It's like that would be a cognitive strategy. It's like using a way of thinking to think through things. It's like the 10-year-old doesn't need to have a soother the same way my 2-year-old does. When my 2-year-old's upset, I need to put the soother in. I also need to often hold her close to my body and use my body to relax her. Right? Think about it. If I pick up a baby that's upset and I'm hyperventilating, I'm like, I probably looked weird doing that. But if I'm like breathing super intensely and my heart's pounding, I'm not going to calm down the baby. Think of what's happening. The baby's upset. I bring the baby close to me. That biophysical contact is having a sync effect on the baby where they're actually, it's not like the baby's aware of this at all. It's biology to biology. My heart rate is starting to affect their heart rate, the baby's heart rate. My breathing's starting to sync with their breathing. I'm actually using my physical body's proximity to them to calm them, to soothe them. And so the idea though is as we get older, we get better at doing that, and our ability to regulate ourselves or to deal with our own stress is largely linked to cognitive things. Right? Elementary school is tough. In elementary school, kids are starting to understand emotions much differently. They're starting to also understand that they can experience multiple emotions, even conflicting emotions at the same time. So like, this isn't a kid example. I'll just use an adult example just to make this point. It's like, imagine if you had like a first date tonight with somebody that you were really excited to meet, but also you're kind of nervous and scared because you've never been on a first date. So you could be like nervous and excited at the same time. Also, kids start to become more aware of the triggers, and that word gets used a lot, but like, I mean it literally here of like, as you get older, part of maturing is realizing I've been here before. I know that if I let myself stay in this mind state, nothing's good's going to happen. I'm going to go down this same path I've been down. I've seen this movie before. I know that I need to get up and do something different. So they're starting to understand the chain of events that leads to their negative moods better. They're getting better at being able to hold back or suppress certain feelings and redirect their feelings. And as they're learning more about their own feelings, it's also developing their empathy or their ability to care and understand and relate to other people. Right? If you think of empathy as like both a mental and emotional thing, it's like, can you sort of imagine in the deepest sense of the word what it would be like to both think and feel like me? And that as the kids' emotions are getting stronger and better and more defined, their ability to then take that emotional understanding and help them understand others increases. If you wanted to add to your notes, moral always means right or wrong. So if I was, the classic moral question is like, okay, you have well, it's called Heinz's dilemma, and it's like, okay, Heinz is this guy that I might actually have a video on Heinz later in the course. But anyways, Heinz is a guy that like his wife's sick. I'll just tell this really quick and I'll do the more detailed explanation later. And he tries to like save up money to buy medicine for his wife, and he can't save up enough money, and he tries to get loans and he can't get enough money anyway. And so he finally, his last plea is he goes to the actual like company where they make the medication, and he asks for a meeting with the head boss, and he goes and he's having this meeting with the head boss, and he's trying to explain to this head boss that his wife's really sick and really needs this medication, and he's done everything he can, and he promises he would do all these things if the guy would help him, and the guy just sort of laughs at him and doesn't seem to care, and then gets a phone call. And so the boss of the company gets this phone call and takes the phone call and kind of turns. And so Hans is sitting there at the table, and he notices on the table there's a box that contains a huge supply of the medication he needs. He notices the guy that the boss he's talking to is like looking out the window, talking on the phone. Should he steal the box? And you ask this question to kids at different ages, and you see that the answer they give shifts. It's like the older the kid, the more likely they are to say that he should just steal the box. Of course, steal the box. Your wife's dying. What are we even talking about here? And so their ability to understand right and wrong, and how right and wrong is sometimes situationally affected, is developing, that they're developing these deeper thoughts and feelings and behaviors about what kind of people should do and how we should act, and especially how we should act towards each other. I I sometimes when I'll explain something like this in class, I'll like use the example of imagine if I was with all of you and I'm like, okay, everybody follow me. Let's go to the bar or something. We go and we leave the room and I leave the room first and immediately close the door after me. It's like, that's not illegal. That's weird as anything though. It's like, not only did I not hold the door for people, I didn't even like go through and sort of hold the door for the next person or just go through and leave it. I like closed the door after me. It's like, there's nothing illegal about that, but it's sort of not our convention is to like leave the door open and help it and hold the door for people. It's like ever since I was a kid, I was told that's what a good person does is like help the old lady that's struggling with her bag and hold the door for the person carrying something heavy. And that stuff's so important. And that stuff's been lost a lot, that like chivalry or just like people don't want to hold doors for people anymore. People don't want people to have wrong impressions. People retreat into themselves and it makes our social world colder for all of us. And so as kids are getting older, they're getting more and more understanding of all this. Okay, so social cognitive theories, this idea that like actually resisting temptation and resisting urges to do things you know you shouldn't be doing actually takes quite a bit of mental effort. And so part of quote unquote being a better person is developing the ability to stay true to that. And some of that demands mental discipline, a disciplined cognitive system. And then that last piece, that another way that you kind of teach kids, it's like if I see my daughter's upset, if I can get my little daughter, my younger daughter, to like go bring her like a granola bar or something that she likes and like say, here you go, Evie, with their nice little sweet baby voice. And then it's like, I'm actually sort of teaching the younger one about emotion. It's like giving kids opportunities to do nice things for people is one of the best favors you can give them because it helps them learn how their behavior affects the emotional state of others. And when they become aware of that, they'll start acting based on that. And the ripple butterfly effect of that is people will like them more and act more positively towards them. So just like you can put people in situations that makes them more antisocial, the opposite is also true. You can become more pro-social. Okay, I'm gonna hopefully that recorded okay. I'm gonna stop this and then I'll do the parenting part as a third part. Just because since I'm one taking this, I'm gonna do them in slightly shorter segments so that if there's a huge mistake, I don't have to redo the whole thing basically. All right, my friends, I'll see you in part 3.